Hey everyone, I'm Bob Vander, Plaats, president of the Family Leader, and also a member of the 120,000 Reasons Coalition. And I'm thrilled to have Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy with us today. Vivek, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Bob. It's good to talk to you on this issue.
As you all know, Armenia, the first Christian nation, has twice now been the victim of genocide. First in 1915, and now 108 years later, we're witnessing a second genocide of the Armenian people. And just this past week, Hamas began its bloody attack on Israel. People everywhere appear to be being attacked for their faith. Recently, you appeared on Tucker Carlson and spoke about this crucial issue. What is it about this issue that has prompted you to be the first GOP candidate to speak out on it?
Well, I think there's a few things going on here, Bob. I think that one of the things I've tried to do in this campaign is to be a little bit ahead of where others are in terms of elevating issues that the media isn't covering, elevating issues that other politicians aren't covering, and especially where I think there are cultural and cynical reasons at work, as I think there are here. Both financial influences, the Azerbaijan lobby and otherwise, that have purposefully suppressed this story over the last several years, really even since 2020. And then I think there are some deeper seated cultural issues. If we're, Bob, you and I have known each other, we're just getting right into it and being a little bit raw here. I think that the fact that Christians are the victims here, I think relate to the fact that that's part of why this hasn't received the attention that it has, just to call it bluntly. And I mean, the ultimate, maybe obvious irony is in this. I'm not Christian, but I think that that's not a coincidence. I think that there is a certain self-flogging impulse in the United States that if there are certain classes of victims that are viewed to be part of a historical or the wrong side of a historical hierarchy, they're supposed to shut up, sit down, and do as they're told. And so I think the combination of those financial forces, which we can talk about, but this deeper culture of self-loathing, which I think exists in America, but which I may say I think maybe exists in a lot of Republican Christian Americans, I think has conspired to make this an issue that is beyond the pale to talk about. I'm guided by the facts, and so, Bob, it might be helpful. I mean, there's a lot of detail here, but I'm wondering if, I'm sure this audience is very familiar with it and maybe doesn't need it, but if it would be helpful for me to lay out what I see as some of the most salient elements here, I'm happy to do that, just to foreground what the heck it is we're talking about.
I think it'd be worthwhile.
And look, you, Bob, and 120,000 Reasons, and the audience base here, many will have even a more detailed understanding of the history here than I will, and that's a good thing. But I'm sharing with you not for the purpose of preaching or education, but to give you a sense of the facts that spoke to me the most, so that you have a sense for where I'm coming from on this. I see a lot of analogies. I think people will be upset for me to saying this because it's not exactly the same in any sense, and I'm not claiming it's exactly the same, but a lot of analogies to what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, where Russia is now, in this ongoing war, occupying certain regions of Ukraine, in the eastern region of Ukraine, the Donbas region, that were historically, and still are, Russian-speaking, Russian-identifying, hadn't been represented in Ukraine's parliament for the better part of the last 9 years, with a long and complicated history, with a ceasefire some time ago, a Budapest memorandum dating then back to 1994, and I'll tell you why that's an important reason in the Armenia conflict, where that's received a ton of U.S. attention, saying that this was a wrong incursion from Russia into Ukraine, and so much so that the U.S. has to use military resources to defend it. And so against that backdrop, go to a different part of the Russian or former USSR periphery, you have a conflict playing out with some real parallels. It's not exactly the same, but some real parallels to what happened in Russia-Ukraine. So dating back to 1994, keep in mind, that was the date of the Budapest Memorandum as it relates to Ukrainian autonomy. In 1994, there's a different agreement that's reached at the end of the first Nagorno-Karabakh war. And I know that's not that's an Americanized pronunciation. Nagorno-Karabakh, something like this, will be the correct pronunciation. But for purposes of this discussion, I'll use an Americanized statement of it, the Nagorno-Karabakh region, Armenia gained control of it. And that's where things landed in 1994. We in the post-Soviet Union, after the fall of the Soviet Union, we didn't go back and relitigate all forms of history to the beginning of time. But we did say, okay, that was the fall of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union actually had made some mistakes, I believe, in how they organized this region of the world. And so they took the Nagorno-Karabakh region and sort of classified it as a part of Azerbaijan, as sort of in the sphere of Azerbaijan. That was a mistake because Armenian Christians have lived here, but we're not going to go relitigate all the mistakes of the Soviet Union. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there were a lot of decisions made. The 1994 Budapest Memorandum as it relates to Ukraine. Here in 1994 agreement after Armenia regained control over the Nagorno-Karabakh region. Okay. And we don't have a map here, but you're looking at it, that's sort of, it would be easier if you're looking at a map, but it's the eastern part of Armenia that this was annexed as a special autonomous zone that was supposed to be its own region, but that had a land bridge, a bridge to it from the rest of Armenia. Well, that was settled, you would think, until Azerbaijan, with really no reason at all, although we can come back and talk about what some of the actual reasons were, had the might, power, the treasure, and the military capacity. How did they get that? We'll come back to that in a second. That just decides to seize a lot of that region, the Nagorno-Karabakh region. And then they continued in September of 2023, that is to say, just weeks before now, when we're having this conversation, to take the rest of what they hadn't captured, and to capture in December 2022, leading up to that, one of the key land passes between Armenia and the rest of Nagorno-Karabakh, violating total international norms and agreements. Now, where did they get the might to do this? And this is part of what draws me into this, because I'm an America First conservative, Bob. I'm not looking to solve every major problem in other parts of the world. But one of the areas where this relates to the American interest is at least looking ourselves in the mirror and recognizing that the U.S. partly played a role in letting Azerbaijan being as militarily strong as it was. There are what's called these Section 907 exemptions that were given that allowed the U.S. to transfer military equipment to Azerbaijan, to arm Azerbaijan militarily. There were the Iran sanctions, which previously stopped the building of pipelines through Iran, except there was a special exemption granted to the Trans-Adriatic pipeline that Azerbaijan wanted to build. And why was that the case? It's the product of something that's, if I may say, near and dear to my heart in this campaign that relates to reviving this country: corruption, right here in the United States of America, or at least a form of soft corruption. You could call it legal corruption, perhaps, if it's done technically within the bounds of the law, but in the form of lobbying. Azerbaijan has 4 lobbying firms, many of which staffed by ex-Obama and ex-Hillary Clinton crowd, from the David Plouffes to the, you can go down the list of the people who have been the Podesta groups of the world that have either been paid in junkets by the Azerbaijan lobby or hired in their groups as lobbyists in the United States that have achieved their stated policy objectives. So it's a long story to bring it back to why we're talking about this now, but in the context of Russia, Ukraine, or U.S. military engagement or potential engagement in other parts of the world, from the Middle East to Ukraine, it strikes me as a glaring, an offensively conspicuous omission to fail to even talk about this issue of Azerbaijan brazenly basically taking over a region that they had no internationally recognized territorial right to take over, and all the worse, aided directly and indirectly by the likes of the United States to do it, but near silence, pin drop silence, because why? In some ways, we have dirty hands in our own country right here by allowing their lobbying influence to have achieved the power that they have, funded by the oil. That's the dirty little secret here, is Azerbaijan's an oil-rich region. SOCAR, the oil company, effectively equivalent entity, is driving a lot of this.
So Vivek, I think the background that you just provided leads into a couple of questions. One is, by funding the Azeri dictatorship, America is supporting forces that are oppressing Christians.
Yeah.
Do you believe, what do you believe Congress and this administration should do to enact strong sanctions to Azerbaijan and to hold him accountable for his genocidal actions against these Christian people so they can get home and live free?
Absolutely. You're talking about the right kind of action to take, which is financial, We have been financially propping up Azerbaijan for a long time. Those Section 907 exemptions need to go. All of the arming of Azerbaijan needs to go. This is an oil-rich country that funds itself through the sale of oil. Well, look at the restrictions that are being placed on countries like Russia. At the very least, here we should look at a region of the world or a particular country that we are responsible for arming and financially strengthening, that it's our responsibility to undo a lot of that damage that we've done. If you're asking me, Bob, not militarily, and I'm one of the minority in the Republican Party and in the national stage that opposes U.S. military engagement in places like Ukraine. So I'm going to stay consistent here and say this is not the place for the U.S. to send troops. But far from it, the U.S. has effectively been propping up and helping Azerbaijan, and so have many U.S. allies, which is what makes the situation uncomfortable. Roll that back and roll further back the damage that we've already done by taking away a lot of that financial support and undoing that in the form of, you could look at sanctions or otherwise, that undo the financial damage that we've already done by propping this regime up.
Well, and again, and I appreciate your candor on this. And you're also one, I mean, you're America first, but you also take a look at how does this play out throughout the world?
Yes.
What would you, I mean, your leadership, Donald Trump before you said, I'm going to drain the swamp. And what you're really laying out is kind of follow the money.
Yes.
How do you say, especially when it comes to this, how do we drain the DC swamp and put a heightened focus on what's really taking place here and persecuting, Christians in the process? How does your leadership play into that?
So look, I think that we need to have some hard restrictions under the broad principle, Bob, that nobody should make money, that is to say profit beyond their salary, from public service. And that includes being part of the political system in any way. So I would have 10-year bans on lobbying the government if you've been a major part of either that government or the electoral process of a major campaign to the presidency or part of a presidential appointment. You're free to go in the private sector, realize the American dream for yourself. I have no objection to that. But utilizing your government connections to lobby that same government, I have a problem with. That'll end on my watch. It's part of a broader anti-corruption campaign that I want to bring to Washington, D.C. I'm against congressmen trading stocks, individual stocks. That has nothing to do with this case, but gives you a sense that I'm not being reactionary to this. This is a symptom of a deeper swamp corruption in Washington, D.C. And my general rule of thumb is, I mean, even if you're, joining the board of a company that somehow you did business with, if you're in the Defense Department awarding a contract, you shouldn't be able to join the board of that company in your years after leaving office. I've seen this even in the likes of the FDA. You shouldn't be able to go work for companies that you regulated not that long ago when you were at the FDA, whether you're a line level review officer or whether you're the head of the FDA. I think it's both bad in substance and, as we see in this particular case, bad in optics and substance because they go together. The optics are bad because the substance is bad. So the fact that you have a bunch of ex-Hillary Clinton mafia and a bunch of ex-Obama mafia, effectively, for lack of a better word, now doing the bidding of Azerbaijan, a country that the same people who will talk about the injustices of what Russia is doing in Ukraine, not only turning the other way, a blind eye, but having actually perpetrated it by using U.S. resources and U.S. policy to do it. That's shameful. And if we don't learn from this mistake, Bob, we're destined to repeat worse of those mistakes in the future. And I just
I think
find it appalling that that's why we don't hear about this issue.
Yeah, I think therein lies the irony. Like, it's regardless how you fall on the Ukraine-Russian, it's okay to talk about it, put a spotlight on it, show what's taking place there.
Yeah.
With Hamas and Israel as well. I mean, we're putting a huge spotlight on that as well as we should, in my opinion. But do you believe that it's the money that is really buying this deafening silence?
I do.
When it comes to the persecution of these Christians?
I think there's two things going on. And so I appreciate the way you framed that, Bob, because I think that Putin's a craven dictator. And so even though I happen to oppose, for U.S. policy reasons, U.S. military involvement in defending those Ukrainian boundaries, that doesn't change my condemnation of much of Putin's craven behaviors. And recognizing that is something that every thinking leader of the United States at least has to recognize the facts of what are happening there. Now, just because Russia's good doesn't mean Russia's bad doesn't mean Ukraine is good. But that's a whole separate debate. But you're right. That's a policy point apart. we ought to be able to recognize the wrongs that are happening or the undesirability of one nation invading the sovereign boundaries of another or an internationally recognized boundary. I think there are two things at work that stop us from talking about that here. And I think that this is an example, Bob, of something you see across different spheres of American life. I think there's broadly two issues we need to address in this country. One is a top-down problem. In other areas I've written about, the merger of state power and corporate power in the domestic culture here at home. Well, here it's a different type of state power and financial power, a merger of those that has somehow created an implicit agreement in Washington, D.C., and the media that follows Washington, D.C., to decide that this is just an issue that doesn't concern us. It's not concerning. We've decided that, we can say with understandable reasons, we're going to talk about what's going on in Ukraine or in Israel or otherwise. That dominates the news cycle, but you don't see a single peep about this issue. So much so that even when I brought that up in that interview with Tucker, where it was germane to the conversation we were having, I personally took immense amounts of criticism for raising this issue as though my raising this issue diminishes what's happening in Israel. And it turns out I have been crystal clear condemning the barbaric nature of what Hamas did in Israel. That is wrong, but talking about this issue doesn't dilute that. To the contrary, I think it's hypocritical not to talk about this issue, and a big part of the reason why, I believe it, and I think some people are upset for me for saying this, but I just think it's true, Bob, is the fact that Azerbaijani oil money has been funding a lot of lobbying in D.C. that has been bluntly successful. It's earned exemptions in policy, building pipelines that would otherwise have violated the Iran sanctions, has created special exemptions for funding and transferring military capabilities and otherwise to Azerbaijan. And it's most importantly had an impact on public debate. But that alone wouldn't have done it, Bob. Because I do think the American people, in many cases, are smart enough and skeptical enough to still see through that corruption at times if they're moved to do it. But there's a separate cultural factor here that it's conspired with, where if this were almost any other religious minority than Christians at issue in Armenia, I think there's a very good chance it would have received more international attention, and particularly U.S. attention, than it has today. But right now, let's just be blunt about it. It's not popular to be Christian in the United States. It's not. And I think that that's part of why it's not culturally a hot victim class. And I think that this is also why, and I think Tucker and I have had conversations about this separately. I think this came up at the Family Leadership Summit in certain of the interviews, Bob, is that even Ukraine has, I think, a questionable track record on persecuting Christians in Ukraine, not in the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, but in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is different from the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And I think that when there are Christian victims, I mean, you may have more of a perspective on this than I do, Bob, but I'm just sharing with you my instincts here. I think that part of why this has been so sweepable under the rug is the nature of the religious minority that's at issue here. And I think that that's part of the discussion as well.
Well, I tell you, we really appreciate your voice. We appreciate your leadership on this issue. And on behalf of 120,000 Reasons, I know they appreciate that as well. But what can we do on the ground? Say from the family leader standpoint, 120,000 Reasons standpoint, those of us in Iowa, those of us across the country, what can we do to say, make this an issue? Because we should be standing up for religious liberty, regardless who it's for. I mean, when Darla and I visited in Egypt, we talked about religious liberty. When we visited in Jordan, we talked about religious liberty. Religious liberty is what is at stake here. What can we do to help promote and cultivate and put a spotlight on what's happening in Armenia?
Great. So in terms of what we can do, I'm going to give two categories. First is policy at the U.S. level, and part of this means elevating the kinds of leaders who are going to carry out the right policies. That's something you can do. And Iowa is a pretty influential state in when it comes to things like who leads this country from the White House. Those are things that Iowans can do. And then I think that there's a separate class of issues of what you can do now, irrespective of the political process. On the political side, make sure that leaders, and I don't mean this in a self-serving way, I mean this whoever it is, leaders who are focused on issues and exhibit courage to highlight an issue like this one where others are looking the other way. That's the kind of leadership we need in the United States right now. I think it's easy to follow the pack. It's harder to run the other direction, to actually stand for an issue that demands moral courage. And as a policy matter, there's real teeth to that. I think we have to stop funding Azerbaijan, directly or indirectly. I think that sanctions of some kind are appropriate to be able to rectify what we ourselves were responsible for financially propping up, and then put an end to all of the lobbying and cronyism, not just on this issue, though on this issue too, but more broadly in the United States. And I think that the next president of the United States, and I think leaders at every level in the United States, need to embrace that type of vision for how we revive our country. And Iowans play a critical role in that. You're going to face a choice in 3 months. That's one of the critical roles that Iowans play. And participating in that, in raising this and to make sure this is part of even the discussion around the Republican presidential nomination process, I think is important. I've made this part of the conversation, but we can go a lot further with it. And the way that Iowans on the ground talk about the issue, believe me, that will have an influence in the way that the rest of the presidential field responds to this issue if they start getting questions at their caucus events or otherwise. They're, in a good way, very responsive to the questions that come from the ground up. And I think that that's a way that Iowans in particular can make a difference. And you have my word that I will continue to play my role in making sure that we don't back off this issue. Now, what can we do as individuals is a separate question. Please, Bob, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add that, I think that there are, I'm sure, and I haven't looked into this, I'd like to learn more about this myself, philanthropic ways to get involved. I've taken a look at the situation in Israel, East Palestine here in Ohio. Every time one of these things has happened during the presidential campaign, I recognize that I wear my hat not just as a presidential candidate, and every one of you watching this in your day jobs or whatever that is, but also as citizens who are able to have an impact personally in other ways. For those of us who have lived the American dream, to whom this country has been kind in allowing us to succeed, I'm sure there are multiple ways that we can have a positive impact, as my family and I try to do. But I think beyond that, even outside of, not everyone has disposable extra money to use charitably to give away to a particular cause, but can use their voice in favor of highlighting this issue too, not just as it relates to politics. But the more you're talking about that issue in your community, I think you're doing a service in this country, raising awareness and creating uncomfortable conversations, that creating that discomfort, that introspection of saying that, hey, what have we done in the United States of America that has created a very problem on the other side of the world that we have now turned a blind eye to, raising that awareness, even in the members of your own community. I mean, there are other tragedies happening right now that rightly are getting attention in terms of Hamas's atrocity committed on Israel. That is wrong, but in that context, it's not inappropriate to also talk about an atrocity that's happening in a different place, affecting a different group, but that's very much wrong as well. And so I think whether it is through your action, whether it's through your volunteering capacity, through organizations like 120,000 Reasons, whether it's financially or whether it's just through your voice, I think it's important that we remind ourselves that we can each make our own difference, however big or however small, to create the country and the world that we want to see. And so, you're doing this every day in your way, Bob, at the Family Leader. I'm doing this in the way that I best can as a presidential candidate and hopefully as the next president. But every citizen in this country has an ability to play their part too. And everyone has to look themselves in the mirror and say whether it's financially or whether it's through excess time or having a voice that can make a difference, to say how are you going to have your impact. And any one of those things, I think, can make a positive difference here now too.
Well, we really want to thank you for shining a light on this issue. We will continue to shine a light on this issue from the Family Leader, 120,000 Reasons as well. So thank you for joining us today, Vivek. We really appreciate it. And for the latest on all of this crisis, please visit us online at 120,000reasons.org and follow us on X, Facebook, and Instagram. And once again, Vivek Ramaswamy, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. It's a good conversation, and thanks for having me.